In book one, the Myths of Sports Coaching, we were really fortunate that the almost all 30 authors that contributed to the book gave up their time to go through their chapter. And because of the nature of how long, I mean, we've done a great job time-wise, but how long the book takes, there is some updates possibly in the research, and also putting a face to the name for the authors who've contributed is just, it's absolutely brilliant for us to be able to do that. And as a learning opportunity to dive in and ask those questions that are context specific to you. So absolutely delighted to have Henrik here this evening, but there's a tiny bit more in the book if you haven't had a chance to read it. This book is just over 40 authors. I mean, to have a book that is affordable, accessible in the language with that many, it's amazing. And I don't mind saying how proud we are of this book and how amazing it is because of the nature of the amount of people who've contributed their time. The sports performance angle came from feedback. We ran the webinar series for 18 months on the first book, as we said, and people were saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? All of a sudden, we had some world-leading people on these topics contribute. And in the presence of Henrik tonight, we are going to look at chapter 3, The Myth of the Zombie, Why Automaticity is Insufficient for Elite Athletes. And as I mentioned already, if elite athletes isn't the area you're working in, there's absolutely no problem in putting those questions in and having a rich conversation because of the diverse audience we know we have already. I won't hold us anymore. We're absolutely delighted to have you here and really looking forward to this session. Amy, over to you for the intro and then we'll get going.
Jen, you didn't give us a bit about you.
It's at the back of the book. Snapshot for those of you I don't know. So I currently work in women's professional football. I'm a performance well-being lead. I'm deeply, deeply passionate about all things women in sport and supporting and developing people on their journey, primarily within sport, but beyond that. Other areas of interest and other areas I work in, sports psychology, coach development. And so I'll pause there, but delighted to be here and delighted to see some familiar faces.
Thanks, Jen. And just again, for those that don't know me, I'm Amy Whitehead. I work at Liverpool John Moores University as an associate professor in sports psychology and coaching. And Jen and I have edited the book Myths of Sport Performance, which has been a kind of a myth too from our first book, Myths of Sport Coaching. So I'm sure a lot of you have been on the Myths of Sport Coaching webinars that we ran over 24 months. And we're really excited to bring you the Myths of Sport Performance webinars over the next kind of 12 to 16 months. So hopefully we'll see some of you over that duration. We'll see some familiar faces pop up. So yeah, first of all, I'd like to introduce Henrik. So Henrik's our first speaker. No pressure, Henrik, for this series. Henrik wrote the chapter, The Myth of the Zombie, Why Automaticity is Insufficient for Aspiring Elite Athletes. Henrik's an associate professor at Christiania University in Norway, and he's a clinical psychologist and he has a PhD in sports psychology. So we're really grateful, Henrik, to have you on this evening. I'll let you share your slides and we'll hand the session over to you tonight.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. There we go. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I take it you can hear me as well. That's awesome. Doesn't always happen on Zoom. Good to have the technical side working. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to write the chapter and do this. And also thanks to all of you showing up. Always great to interact with people with the same interest. And I would definitely agree with Jen saying this is not just for elite sports. I think this idea is very sticky. The idea that we practice and it becomes automatic, and that's the key. And the key to perform is sort of be on this autopilot, which I think is a very sticky idea. Certainly something I met in my practice as a sports psychologist. I still do that. I work with athletes on performance. So the most typical case would be athletes coming in saying, when I practice, it's all fine. It flows. I'm confident. I don't really feel like I have to think that much. For some reason, when the big day comes, I cannot perform under pressure. And it very often boils down to a conversation around today's topic. How can we allow ourselves to perform? And is it realistic to have an automatic performance under pressure? And how can we perform um, even though it's not automatic all the time? So these are things that I think about. It's also part of my PhD. This is pretty much my whole PhD. So I do work on attention in sports, and this was a really good opportunity for me to sort of summarize my ideas, some of my findings, and some of the amazing work done by others too. So I'll try to cover this topic. I won't go into all the things I go into in the book, so there won't be like perfect overlap. I thought it would be interesting to share some new ideas too. And I'll also try to keep it on the bit of the light side in terms of detail, theory, because I realized there might be coaches here today, and for all I know, maybe even athletes. So I'll try to keep it on the applied side, a bit hands-on. And I've included my contact information. So if anybody wants to reach out, that would be amazing. Happy to discuss things, happy to send papers, provide more detail, or anything that you might be interested in. So I thought it would be good to start with sort of defining automaticity. I assume you know what it is or what I mean. I think we all know the idea of automaticity, that if we practice, we tend to be able to perform with less effort. So the classic model by Fitz and Posner, which is sort of um, seen in different models too. A lot of theories would build on this, the idea that when you start something, it's a lot of cognition, it's a lot of thinking. And then you practice and you get to what they call the associative stage, sort of like uh, a little bit less thinking, less focus on what you're doing, but still a bit of that. And then you get to the final stage, autonomous stage, like this is the final destination. Um, you now can perform without much thinking going on. So this is not a new idea. So I thought I would um, have some quotes here. It's not really a presentation in psychology if you don't include William James, very famous psychologist who were early thinking about those things. So the more we can hand over to automatism, he said, the more of our higher powers of mind can be set free. And I think this idea is very true in everyday life, that we enjoy the fact that after a while we can sort of not think about things. We can drive our car or ride our bikes and we can think about something else. We can talk to people. He also had this other quote, which really resonates with athletes in my experience. If you keep your eye on the aim, on the target, you'll hit the target. If you think of your hand, you'll miss your aim. Sort of resembling the idea of athletes saying, feels like I'm overthinking, sort of like paralysis by analysis sometimes. I think so much that I can't even do the most basic thing. And also, of course, not just him, it's coaches. I think this has a lot of buy-in from coaches. Could be partly due to the fact that, for example, John Wooden is very famous for saying the importance of repetition until automaticity cannot be overstated. So I think this is a very sticky idea, has a lot of buy-in from coaches and therefore from athletes, that we tend to emphasize automaticity through practice. So quickly explaining the zombie metaphor, that might be a strange term to bring in. Many people may think that. It's not my term. It's a Norwegian scholar called Breivik who wrote a paper which I think is titled Zombie-like or Superconscious. And it's about consciousness in elite sports. And he basically says if we are to put the automaticity view to the extreme, we end up with a zombie, someone who's like sleepwalking, feeling calm, not really thinking, and not really conscious or aware of what they're doing. So that's the extreme form. But I do think there is some buy-in in the literature. So I just wanted to give an example. For example, Bylock written a very interesting book read by a lot of people outside of academia called Choke, suggesting it's not only possible to perform without thinking or being aware or mental effort, it's also very recommendable. In fact, you may choke if you think about what you're doing. On the other hand, when I talk to coaches, they also bring up, isn't there more to this? And what about athletes having to adapt or think about tactics or make some adjustments? So, for example, Pirlo, the amazing midfielder, wrote a book, and the title speaks for itself. I think, therefore I play. So I think it's a bit of a mixed buy-in at times. And I also think many coaches feel like automaticity maybe yes for certain things, but could that be the whole picture? So that's what I will go into tonight and what I go into in the book. So I think there are mainly three sources of evidence to suggest that as you become better, you may be able to perform with automaticity. And the first is self-report, asking athletes or even anecdotes, listening to athletes speak. What was it like when you performed? What did you think? That's a typical journalist question. What were you thinking? How did you feel? Psychophysiology. If we go back to the definition of automaticity, it's inversely related to mental effort. So the more you practice, the more automatic it becomes, the less effort you spend. And that's really important because that means you can measure these things. Because we know how to measure effort. If you spend mental effort, if you think, if you attend, it will be accompanied by arousal. And we can measure arousal several different ways. We can measure your brain, your eyes, your heart rate. So this is another line of evidence that we'll look at. And also, we can manipulate your attentional focus. So for example, if you are automatic in a task, you should be able to dual task. Sort of like riding your bike. You should be able to talk to a friend at the same time. So to extend that, if elite athletes or any sort of high level performer should be automatic, they should also be able to attend to something else and at least prefer the external focus where they don't focus on their movements. They focus on something outside themselves, and it should be fine or even good for performance. So what I'll do now is I'll present sort of both sides. I'll present some evidence for automaticity, and then I'll present some counter evidence, some evidence on the other side, suggesting it might not be that simple, that it's all automatic. So self-report, I just wanted to mention to begin with how many anecdotes there are. If you ask athletes, for example, on the Whoop podcast, Michael Phelps is sort of interviewed about his process. And the host asks, for example, like when you were walking with the headphones into the arena, what were you thinking? And Phelps is like, nothing, just singing the song. So I think they ended up calling it the winning autopilot, that you practice, 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 and then you can become automatic to be on autopilot. And it's not only in anecdotes. So one example would be Chavez and colleagues did flow research. So I don't know if you're familiar with flow, but it's sort of this experience where you're letting it happen. You're intensely focused. And in this case, athletes were interviewed about what it feels like. And some topics were recurring. So limited thinking, didn't really have to think, and actually feeling quite calm and confident. So these are some example quotes. You're not really thinking, don't have to consciously think about trying to do specific things or tasks. It's almost like I'm blank. It's autopilot, easy. It was weird. I didn't try hard. So these are some topics that come up if you ask people about flow. um, Turning to some counter evidence, we have some studies from Swan and colleagues from 2016, 2017. And I underline recent performance because these athletes were asked to talk about a recent excellent performance. It was like, for example, professional golfers winning a tournament or shooting best rounds. And the reason I underline recent is that arguably it's easier to provide detail about something recent as opposed to the previous example where it could be years since the performance. So based on interviews and analyses, two main states were found. So two main psychological states characterizing excellent performance. And the first was flow, which is letting it happen, like we just saw. Sort of this confident, calm, easy performance. But that was not the full picture. They found another state they called clutch, making it happen. And that was characterized by thinking, task use, and effort. And the interesting thing, I think, from the applied side was that to get flow, you very often had to go via clutch. To begin with, you had to do something to get flow. Flow would very often occur after a good start or after something amazing happened. Clutch was there to begin with, and also during pressure moments. When the pressure was high, there was clutch, not flow. So I think this has some implications. And the most important for me is that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I've worked with athletes who are very interested in flow. Like one athlete I worked with, for example, he was all about flow, and his tactic, his strategy was to not think. That was his main strategy. I'm going to go into this tournament and I'm trying not to think. And I was sort of like, okay, what if that strategy fails? Or what if you find that difficult? What will you do? I'll try even harder not to think, was the answer. And we sort of landed on the idea that wouldn't you be more flexible if you had more than one gear, more than one way to perform? So we ended up with a backup strategy, which actually ended up being the main strategy, to have some task queues. Most athletes will start with no confidence, no real like high confidence. You have to work your way in. So that's the second point, is that yes, you can have flow, yes, you can have confidence, but you very often need to go with effort first. At least you have to be prepared to devote some effort. I also think it's worth underlining the timing issue, because human memory is very fallible. Just watch any true crime on Netflix, and you'll see how imperfect the human memory is. And as Amy and colleagues demonstrated, if you compare what athletes say during the event or shortly after, and you compare that to retrospective recall, like way back, you tend to find more detail for certain things if you ask during or right after, as opposed to way back when. So the human tendency of sort of smoothing over memories is real. And it's very important to look at some evidence also where we have some think aloud, where you think as you perform, for example, or interviews shortly after performing. And I also think it's worth underlining, I think what athletes may mean when they say I don't think sometimes is that they don't think about the consequences. They don't think about all the irrelevant stuff, like what happens if I fail? Oh my gosh, what should I do? Those types of thoughts, yes, I think peak performance is easier if you can avoid that style of thinking. I think that's different from being attentive to task cues, think about what you're doing, visualizing, and those things. So turning to psychophysiology, a couple of main ideas. If you practice, you may experience neural efficiency. That means less sort of brain activity, less arousal overall, and especially hypofrontality. So the frontal lobe seems to be very involved in thinking when we're sort of cognitively active. So the idea is that based on this approach, you should see less cortical activity and arousal if you measure psychophysiological things. And yes, there are some examples of this. A couple of studies from Cheng and colleagues. 2015, darts, people with lots of experience and novices. So they did scalp recordings, and the EEG signal suggested less cortical activity in expert in the final 2 seconds before dart release. And they found very similar things in shooting. And there's a lot of studies on golf putting and darts for practical reasons. So I'll give one counterexample in golf putting by Cook and colleagues at Bangor University. That's where he is now, I think. So experts and novice golfers had their scalps recorded. So from 6 seconds prior putting to putting, from 6 seconds after the putt. So now you have more of a time window. You have longer measurement periods. So in the 2 to 3 seconds before putting, there were less cortical activity in experts. But it changed. In the following 3 seconds, so sort of during the putt, you actually saw some more cortical activity in experts. So that sort of points to something quite important, like when do you measure? Not only with the self-report, but also with this, when do you measure? So I also want to show you some of my work that we did with rowers. I won't provide some detail here for what we did. So we did various trials on the ergometer. We had the Norwegian Olympic team as the sort of expert group, and we have non-elites performing different trials with different cognitive load and physical load. And we measured pupil sizes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but your pupil size tends to become bigger if you think about things, if you spend mental effort. So this is actual recordings of one participant's pupils. On the left, you see baseline. So a rower just looking straight ahead. And you could see on the right side, you see a pupil more dilated and also blinking more frequently. So this is like some key indicators of mental effort. And we actually found that elites had larger pupil sizes. And we're still digging into the why question. I'm looking into some qualitative data. It seems like the elites had more task cues. Seems like they focus on more things and more advanced things. So overall, I would say the evidence is a bit mixed, but I would say that experts, elite athletes, tend to vary their effort. It's not stable. So again, same as self-report, you will find different types of focus, different types of effort. So the reason why it's a bit hard to conclude on this is that we really need more research on this. And it's such a big overrepresentation of relatively simple, discrete, and not very physical tasks. So if you were to read the psychophysiological literature and sort of guess which sports are more popular, you would probably say darts and golf, especially golf putting. So many studies on this, and it's obviously for a practical reason. So I think there's reason to think we need more diversity, and it could be also that you see more effort in different sports. I'm not saying by any means that golf putting or darts is easy, but I would say we have sports with more complexity in terms of movement variability and also in terms of physical demands and especially tactical demands. So not just execution, but also the tactical process and everything that goes into sports, apart from just the moment where you sort of release the dart, whatever. I would also say that we need more studies with the very highest level elites. So fantastic article by Swan and colleagues from 2015, sort of what is an elite athlete. And it seems sensible that at the very highest level, you may have some athletes that might be able to perform automatically, but they may not choose to perform that way. Maybe they are more motivated to invest effort. Maybe in order to win, they have to spend effort more than just the bare minimum. So that would sort of be my conclusion on psychophysiology, that you do have some evidence suggesting that athletes actually spend more effort, but the evidence is mixed and we need more studies. So the final line of evidence would be attentional focus. So what happens if you ask athletes to do various things? And the main prediction would be, if you are elite, if you're an expert, and you're automatic, focusing externally should be either okay or even a good thing. So that could be task relevant things. So focusing, for example, on the target that you try to hit, or the golf club, or the golf ball. You should not focus on your body according to this sort of view of automaticity as something that will not help the athlete, at least at the elite level. So that way you can test different things. You can do dual tasking and you can try to manipulate different types of focus and see what happens with performance. So I'll start with the dual task example by Rob Gray, quite a long time ago, but he did some fascinating studies with virtual batting. So he had experts and novices do this virtual batting task. They received two types of pitches. So pitches, balls were thrown two different ways. And the task was obviously to hit the ball. And in a dual task condition, they did this, and they also had to recognize the pitch of a tone. So was this a high tone or a low tone? And they had to verbalize the answer. So dual tasking by swinging the bat and recognizing tone. And the findings suggested that novices did better in the single task. Experts, no difference. So they were fine. They seemingly were able to perform well with this concurrent task, in addition to baseball batting. And I'll just give one example. There are numerous examples of external focus. So I'll just give an example in case you're not familiar with external focus. So Porter and colleagues, Division I athletes, so skilled athletes in different sports, basketball, volleyball, did long jumps, so tried to jump as long as possible. In the control condition, you just jump as you normally would. Internal, focus on extending your knees as rapidly as possible, which for some reason is a very typical cue in this line of research in jumping tasks. And they did two external focus conditions. So one near, try to jump as far past the starting line as possible. And the far one was jump towards the cone, which I've sort of included in the image. So this cone in the distance, try to jump towards that one. And the findings were in line with the attentional focus effect. External focus is better, especially far distance. So jump towards something led to greater distance, and internal was worst, even worse than control. Again, this is a very consistent finding. It's often referred to as the attentional focus effect, the fact that you perform better if you try to focus on your target or focus on something outside yourself. So I'll just include some counter evidence before we move on to the broader implications for coaches and some conclusions. So just to give a counter example, we had male college football players, more than 10 years of experience, single task, juggle a ball, classic sort of drill in a small area. Dual task, you had to juggle the ball and also perform some math. And as you can see, this is more difficult than recognizing tone pitch. Now we're talking actual mental effort. So you had to do some math while you were juggling the ball. And they found better performance in single task, which in my view could be due to many things, but seems like they actually managed to devote, like to challenge the mental capacity, to challenge in a more difficult dual task than Rob Gray. Attentional focus in rowing. So admittedly, this is novice participants, so not really an elite sample for this, but I think it shows some interesting ideas. So they had different focus cues, not just one, which I think is a very good point because a lot of studies will use one cue. And most coaches that I talk to and most athletes will say we use more than one cue. So they had different cues. So this is just an example. Try to focus on moving your legs, for example, which is a very common thing in rowing, to focus on your legs because that's how you should start the drive phase. Or external cues, focus on the seat beneath you. If you move your feet, you'll move your seat. So typical external focus cue. And for this study, you actually saw better performance in the internal condition, which in my view is because this time the internal focus was actually relevant. For this study and for rowing, it's actually quite relevant to focus on your legs. And I would also add, I have some work in progress with my elite sample, and it seems like they actually had more internal focus cues than non-elites in my work, which is something I'm working on these days. So overall, athletes can have different types of focus. There's, again, more than one way to perform. And yes, if we're talking about sort of this easy dual task, do this one like easy thinking on the side, I think that's fine. I also know there are some interventions with athletes using dual tasks. So, for example, a golfer who has a tendency of sort of overthinking or have this paralysis by analysis. I know some of them use like very simple counting tasks to stay distracted, to not think about consequences. I think that could be fine, but it really has to be on the lighter side in terms of effort if it's to be successful. So it seems like experts might be able to handle some easier dual tasking, but the focus cues should be task relevant. And I think academics should really try to engage and talk with coaches on this. There are some cues in the literature that I've never seen in any applied context. I played volleyball at the elite level, and there are some cues from volleyball that I've never seen and that I find very strange. And I think part of the reason why you have some one-sided findings is that some of these cues are not really relevant. So you have this artificial context in research sometimes. So I think the main takeaway from theory and the literature and the empirical studies is athletes need to focus on relevant things if any focus cue should be relevant. So if you focus on hitting a target, that makes sense. You perform well because it's very relevant to focus on the target. It's not necessarily because you have more automaticity. You could be more successful focusing externally because the target is actually quite important and the target tends to be external. So I think we sometimes confuse automaticity and task relevant processing. So just some theoretical implications. There is one model that I would sort of summarize these findings with. So Bertolo and colleagues have 4 types of performance. You have a type 1 where you have low effort and high performance, and you have the high effort, high performance. This is in line with Swan's work, clutch and flow. You also have some bad performance styles. So you could have the fatigued athlete not spending effort, therefore failing. Or you could have these sort of overthinking or paralyzed athlete. This makes sense that you can have different types of performance. Then you can start working with athletes on where they are and how they might be able to find different types of good performance and avoid the bad ones. And overall, I would just say my main take on the literature is that we need athletes who focus on task relevant information, who are actually engaged cognitively in the task by processing or attuning to information, depending on which theory you adhere to. I thought I would just share a few thoughts on why I think this myth is very common, or why we tend to hope for automaticity. Why do we like the idea of automaticity so much? I think it's a romantic idea. I think we hope it's possible to have this sort of state where it's almost a bit mystical, like what's going on, we don't know, where we just sort of turn off something and we can find this peak performance zone. Seems very intriguing and also more pleasurable than the hard work, finding cues, thinking, attending. I think that's part of it. I also think it's partly true that we have automaticity. I think John Wooden was right to a certain extent that if a basketball player dribbles up the court, I think it helps to have certain things automatized, but that does not mean the whole performance is automatic. Certain things, yes, but not the whole thing. I also think research tends to be too simple. I think research contexts will have task environments, tasks that are way simpler than most conditions in sports. That could be part of the reason we have quite a few studies suggesting, yes, you can achieve automaticity quite quickly, and maybe, yes, there are some differences between experts and non-experts. But that doesn't mean the elite athlete performing in the actual arena will think or attend that way. And I also would like to build on Anders Eriksson's point on what makes an elite athlete. And to win at the highest level, Eriksson would argue, you have to resist automaticity. You cannot just be satisfied when it's automatic. And he gives some examples. For example, everyday tasks, it's fine to have automaticity. He gives the example of shoelaces, when you tie your shoelaces. And I like to give the example, let's say we started a competition, world championships of shoelace tying, to tie your shoelaces the fastest. And you were to enter that competition. Wouldn't you start thinking about how you tie your shoelaces? And wouldn't you start to attend? And wouldn't you start to spend some mental effort? I would. So Eriksson's point would be, maybe some experts, like at maybe not the highest level, but also for everyday tasks, things we practice, yes, we could achieve automaticity, but maybe that's not enough to win at the highest level. And not to take anything away from college samples, but a lot of the expert samples in research in the literature are also not at the highest level. Again, going back to Swan's paper on defining elite athletes. So I think something has to do with the samples that we bring into research as well. So I thought I would finish by some implications from for coaching. So how to sort of take all of this away, what would be sort of my advice if you're working with athletes, and sort of wonder where to start. So I would go away from the idea that you should not think. That should not be the goal, to have sort of mindless athletes not thinking. I would start with the task, and I would consider what cues may promote success. So where's the information? There's a lot of good external cues, and that's great about this literature on external focus. You may find some really good cues in the external environment. You may find some good cues in the body. You may find some cues in equipment. What can promote task success? What does it take to achieve success in this task, in this sport? And then you can work from there to find some cues and be creative too. I would also consider the person. So just to give a few examples, I would consider, for example, the skill level. What can this person handle in terms of focus cues? Cognitive capacity. There is some research suggesting some people have more capacity for thinking. Maturity will play a role. How old they are. There's also research suggesting personality matters. So for some people, it's very natural to think about task cues, maybe even have a lot of task cues. And some personality traits are associated with spending more effort. So I think to a certain extent, the personality, what feels natural to the person, should also be in play. And also preference. There was a study in 2013 suggesting internal, external didn't really matter. Whatever worked with the athlete, whatever the athlete preferred and had some experience with. And I wouldn't take that to the extreme that you should only use cues that the athlete is comfortable with, but I would definitely consider the athlete's preference. And my sort of final, if I were to give sort of what are we looking for, I would say flexibility. I think we should look for flexible athletes that can perform well in different ways, under pressure, with confidence, but also at times when maybe confidence is not there. And you should be prepared to spend some effort, and then maybe you can have some flow if you're lucky. So I have references that I would like to sort of just show in case people are interested. Again, I would be happy to send references, ideas to anyone interested. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Henrik. If you can just stop sharing your slides and we'll open up for questions.
Right.
Awesome. We have got one question from Kira, but she's also then said, I think he's answered this for me, but I'll ask it anyway because you might be able to elaborate. So she asks about, based on the Rowan study for novices, can you apply that to youth sports and to suggest that internal focus of attention is preferred when learning new skills or developing skill sets compared to external focus?
Yeah, I think there are some studies or is some research suggesting internal focus might be more natural for novices. And I believe it used to be an idea that internal focus might be more effective for novices. If you ask the sort of hardcore scholars who adhere to external focus, they would say external is better always. Doesn't really matter if it's novice or expert. But yes, I think there are several reasons why internal might work for novices. in the beginning. Also seems very hard to coach novices without ever touching on the internal side. Just if you're not supposed to mention movement patterns, postures, trajectories, it seems very hard. So yes, I would say for novices, the internal seems more natural in many cases and could be a good way to go.
Thanks, Henrik. And it was making me think about my own research where we've asked kind of novices and more skilled performers to verbalize what they're thinking, and where we found that novices do verbalize more internally focused things or information, whereas our external, I won't use the word expert, but our more skilled performers are more kind of externally focused, but there are still a mixture of the two. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, variability, you have different types of focus. And again, I just touched on some work in progress. We're looking into the qualitative data I have from my PhD, and again, we seem to find that the elites they just use more cues in general. So they would think about more things in their trials, and they also had more internal, but they also had more of the other categories. So sort of an interesting finding, but I'm sure you'll find different types of focus if you ask athletes either after or during the event.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about kind of performing under pressure. So that recommendation of external focus is often recommended when people are experiencing, pressure, or going back to like the choking research and kind of focusing externally. That seems to be a lot of the recommendations. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly one way that you can guide your focus towards something that might be helpful. I don't think it's the only way. There are cases, just to give some anecdotal examples, in snooker. I know some players will focus on some part of their body that's not really relevant. So I heard about snooker players focusing on their pinky toe.
Okay.
And the idea is that it's not really relevant for excellence. It's just that it keeps them from thinking about certain things that might be harmful to performance. I think we can all agree trying to control key limbs or key parts of your body is not good. It's not going to help you. But it's also a difference between focusing to try to control versus focusing to just monitor. So you can have athletes saying, yes, I sort of attend to my body, but I don't try to force something. I don't try to control things. So there are so many nuances to this. I mean, it's very hard to say this is the best. But if you go external, yes, there are some advantages. You might allow your body to be more natural in many ways. And of course, there's a lot of relevant information in the external environment too. I would say external focus is definitely worth trying out, but it's not the only answer.
Yeah, so give it a go with the clients that we're working with or our athletes. If it doesn't work, think about another alternative.
Yeah, because I think it's very easy to be very prescriptive and internal as a coach, because we spend a lot of time analyzing athletes, and it's like, for example, if you want someone to have a higher elbow in some sport, it's so easy to just say, hey, keep a high elbow, like elevate your elbow, and that might not actually be the most effective way. So I'm very thankful for the literature sort of pointing towards the external and maybe asking us to be more creative instead of just focusing on the body and what we see in our athletes.
Cool. Lena's asked a question here. I would be interested if you have also researched the combination of focus and the effort of controlling emotions.
Was that asking about research sort of combining different types of focus?
I think so. A combination of focus and the effort. Yeah, she said yes.
Yeah. That seems very interesting. I don't. It's always the tendency of having internal versus external.
Mm-hmm.
There is some work suggesting that when athletes actually perform, they tend to mix. So
Mm-hmm.
when they're asked to be external, they actually tend to be a little bit internal as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I haven't really seen work that explicitly try to combine the two. That would
Yeah.
be very interesting to me, at least.
Yeah.
Um, I know there's work going on, sort of going beyond the dichotomy, so going into holistic focus, which is more like focus on your form or focus on the rhythm of the whole movement.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of going beyond internal versus external, but I would love to see some work combining internal, external. I think that would be something athletes maybe do all the time.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And so that might happen just kind of simultaneously or at different times throughout an event. And you made me think about you mentioned flow and clutch. So Trish Jackman led a paper that we worked on where we looked at flow and clutch and how it occurs over the duration of a race. And actually, we're not just in flow for the whole time, or we're not in clutch for the whole time. And it can happen kind of interchangeably throughout the duration of an event, depending on what's presented to us. So if an event becomes more difficult, we might engage in more clutch. If it becomes less, easier, so for example, when we're running, if it's flatter and it's an easier terrain, automaticity and our flow might occur. But as soon as we come to a little hill, we might then have to engage in clutch and change our attentional focus. So I think that's something that's really kind of resonated with me within your presentation.
Yeah, I think again, flexibility. If
Mm-hmm.
we are to have winning athletes, they should have several gears. And
Yeah.
yeah, going back to my example with the athletes I was working with, who sort of had this one strategy and it's quite vulnerable. And there will be times when it's really hard to be confident, really hard to be automatic. So I think it's good to be prepared. And
Yeah.
if there's one thing to be prepared for, I would say clutch, because I mean, flow sort of happens. I mean, more naturally, it seems. So I would be prepared to spend some effort, especially under pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great point. Flexibility. That's the key word for this webinar tonight. Thank you, Henrik. I really, really appreciate your time, and I'm sure everyone at home does. Jen, over to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Read the chapter, read it again, read the research, and still 5 pages of notes this evening. So thanks for that. As I'm sure people with us tonight and people who watch it on the YouTube channel, Amy and I'll post on our social channels the link for those of you who don't have it and are not subscribed. Join us next month. It'll be Wednesdays from now going forward. So it'll be the 26th of February, 7 to 8. And we are joined by Jane Booth, who I actually think was with us tonight. So she is going to share some incredible work she's done research on and developed that in many projects since her PhD. It's leadership, a title bestowed from above, a position of awarded power, truth or myth. The chapter is brilliant. There's loads of authentic leadership conversations happening both in the media and in different NGBs, Olympic, professional and pathway at the moment in my world. So definitely one not to be missed. And you'll see the flyer going out with the link as well. So again, Henrik, thanks a million. Thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. Have a lovely evening and rest a week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Henrik. And thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Henrik.
Thanks, guys.
Lots of people very happy with that. Brilliant. Oh, John, thanks for sharing that. I know people are leaving, but